From the hood to Harvard's rival, poor black girl wrecks Yale's stage. They laughed when she walked on stage, until her words left Yale's finest speechless. This isn't just a story about a debate. It's about a 17-year-old black girl from New Orleans who walked into a room built to exclude her and tore down centuries of silence. With nothing but truth, fire, and grit, stay with this. Because by the end, you won't just remember her name. You'll feel what it means to fight without permission. And wins. Black girl mocked at Yale's door, but she didn't flinch. The doors of Sanders Hall at Yale creaked open with an elegance that felt centuries old. Stone walls rose like judgment, and stained glass windows scattered cold light onto polished mahogany floors. This place didn't whisper history, it declared it. It wasn't built for everyone, and it certainly wasn't built for a girl like Maya Bellamy, 17 years old, from the 7th Ward of New Orleans, public school student, daughter of a waitress who worked the night shift and prayed during the day. Maya didn't carry a resume wrapped in legacy. She carried a notebook with bent pages, edges softened by years of gripping it too tight. She paused in the entryway of the lecture hall, eyes wide but steady. Her shoes were scuffed, her blazer too big at the shoulders. Her skin was a warm, deep brown, and her southern accent dipped every word in molasses. A few heads turned. Some stared openly. One girl leaned toward her friend and whispered behind a manicured hand. "That can't be a competitor, must be here to help serve snacks or something." Maya heard it, she always did, but she didn't flinch. She took a breath, smoothed down her thrift store blazer, and stepped further into the room. Each click of her shoes on the polished floor felt louder than it should have, like the building itself was questioning her. Then it came, the voice. "Who let you in here?" It didn't come from the back, it came from the front row, the epicenter of confidence. Gregory Hawthorne III stood up slowly, like he was taking center stage. Tall, angular, Yale blue tie. His face wore that casual cruelty that didn't need to shout to cut deep. Laughter snuck through the air like smoke. A couple of students chuckled, then quickly looked away. No one said anything to defend her. Maya looked straight at him, but she didn't respond. She just kept walking, passing rows of pressed blazers and polished brogues, her fingers tightening around the notebook like it was a lifeline. Professor Grant stood at the front of the room, clipboard in hand. Her face unreadable, voice clipped and cool. "Take your seats. We begin in 5. Maya slid into a chair in the far corner. Alone. Still, she sat straight. The same way her mother taught her. Later that day, as orientation groups broke off into circles, Maya found herself on the outside. No one asked her name. No one handed her an info sheet. At the snack table, 2 girls turned their backs when she reached for a cup of punch. She retreated to the edge of the room, pulled out her notebook, and started flipping through her notes. Pages filled with late-night scribbles, Supreme Court cases, personal anecdotes, rebuttals written in the margins in her mother's hand. Back home, their apartment had no air conditioning that summer. But her mother still sat with her night after night, practicing eye contact, clarity, control. "You're gonna be louder than the room, baby, just by being real." Maya smiled faintly at the memory. Then her phone buzzed. A text from her mom. It was just one line. "You don't need their invitation, you just need them to hear you." She blinked fast and locked the screen. She wouldn't cry, not here. Professor Grant began calling names for the first mock round. Gregory's group was announced first. He high-fived a few friends and swaggered up toward the front. When Maya's name was read, the room paused. People actually turned to look. Did she say New Orleans? Like really? Someone laughed under their breath. "She's not gonna last a day." Maya stood quietly, walked to the circle she'd been assigned, and sat. No one said hello. One boy shuffled his chair an inch away from her like her presence made the space smaller. As the mock debates began, Gregory spoke first. His voice had a cadence that knew applause. His posture screamed private school. He used terms like meta-analysis and rhetorical framing like he'd been born in a library. When Maya's turn came, the room barely looked up. She stood slowly, cleared her throat, and began speaking in that slow New Orleans rhythm, measured, low, rooted. Her opening line was simple. Most of y'all don't know me, that's okay. But when I speak, I'd appreciate it if you actually listen. 'Cause I didn't come here to entertain you. I came here to compete. There was a brief pause, a subtle shift in the air. She went on, building her argument slowly, tying national statistics to local pain. Talking about schools in her community where textbooks had pages missing. About classmates who didn't make it past sophomore year. About how debate taught her that knowledge was power, but only if someone gave you the mic. When she finished, there was no applause, just a long, uncomfortable silence. Gregory leaned in and said just loud enough for her to hear, "Cute story. Too bad this is Yale, not story time." Maya didn't even blink. She gathered her notes and walked back to her seat. That night, back in her dorm room, the one assigned to out-of-state students who couldn't afford hotels, Maya opened her laptop. The screen flickered weakly as she pulled up research articles, court cases, and university admission stats. She worked for hours while the hallway outside buzzed with students forming alliances, laughing in pods of privilege. She was alone, but she wasn't alone in spirit. Back in the 7th Ward, her mother was probably finishing the dinner rush, wrapping fried catfish in foil and praying for her baby girl. Maya closed her eyes and repeated the words her mother always said before a big speech. "You don't need to prove you belong, baby. Just make 'em regret they ever doubted you." And with that, she turned back to her screen. Tomorrow she would be on that stage again, and this time they would listen. The voice they tried to ignore, but couldn't silence. The debate hall on day one buzzed with the sound of entitlement, laughter echoing off high stone arches, lanyards flashing names from legacy prep schools. Resumes passed around like war medals. Every student there had been trained, polished, sharpened for this moment, except Maya Bellamy. She sat alone at the edge of the lecture hall, back straight, notebook open on her lap. Her fingers moved across the pages like she was touching something sacred. Handwritten arguments filled each line, mixed with her mother's looping script from late-night prep sessions over reheated gumbo. Across the room, a student from Manhattan's elite Dalton school leaned toward a classmate and whispered, "She's still here. Honestly, I thought she'd quit by now." Another replied under a fake cough, "She probably thinks this is American Idol or something." The laughter was quiet but pointed, like little blades hidden in smiles. Maya didn't respond. She didn't even lift her eyes. She just kept writing. Later, while most students flocked together in study clusters, comparing citations and swapping sources, Maya made her way to the campus library. The building loomed with cold, academic grandeur. Inside, light spilled through stained glass onto long oak tables. She chose a quiet corner, opened her outdated laptop with the flickering screen, and began to dig. She read Supreme Court rulings line by line, dug through university admissions data, analyzed case studies. She didn't skim, she devoured. Hours passed. Her fingers cramped. Her coffee went cold, but she didn't stop. Her phone buzzed once. A text from her mom. "You ready to burn the place down, baby?" Maya smiled to herself and typed back, "No matches needed, just truth." The next morning, the tournament officially began. The room transformed. Rows of spectators filled the benches. Judges, professors, student reporters. The podium stood like a spotlighted island in the center of judgment. Maya's name was listed last on the speaker sheet, dead last. She stood at the side of the room watching other students take the stage. Their speeches were seamless, timed to perfection, delivered with the swagger of practice and privilege. They opened with jokes, cited peer-reviewed journals, delivered final lines designed for applause. Gregory, as expected, went first. He commanded the room like he owned it. Every sentence was a performance. He used phrases like data-driven fairness and meritocratic excellence. He sprinkled in stories about his grandfather's legacy at Yale. The audience nodded. The judges smiled. His closing line drew scattered claps. When Maya's name was finally called, the room hesitated. One beat, two. Then a student muttered under their breath, "Oh, we're ending with charity now." She stood slowly. Each step to the podium felt heavier than the one before. She passed rows of tightly buttoned blazers and perfectly parted hair. Some students looked down, others smirked. A few just stared, waiting for her to crumble. Maya placed her notebook on the stand. Her fingers shook slightly. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "Before I begin," she said, "I want to thank Yale for letting me speak, even if some people in this room believe I shouldn't be here." The room went still. A few chuckles, then silence. She didn't pause. "Today we're debating whether socioeconomic status should be minimized in college admissions. That's funny to me, because for some of us that's not a theory, that's Tuesday." Her words cut with quiet precision. She didn't posture. She didn't perform. She delivered. She spoke of underfunded schools where classrooms still used chalkboards and doors didn't lock. Of students who walked miles to school because there was no bus. Of communities where the debate club was a borrowed desk in the back of a library that only opened twice a week. She quoted rulings from Justice Sotomayor. She cited longitudinal studies from the National Education Equity Project. She laid bare the invisible weight she carried just to reach this room. Then she locked eyes with Gregory, voice calm. "Some of us weren't born with legacy. We had to fight for every invitation, including this one." Her final line landed like a stone in still water. "I'm not here for sympathy, I'm here for fairness, because I don't need your pity, I need your respect." Silence followed, no polite applause, just stillness. The kind of stillness that means the room is actually thinking. She stepped down. A few claps trickled from the back. One judge nodded slightly. Gregory smirked but didn't speak. Outside, Maya sat on the stone steps, breath visible in the cold morning air. Her hands still trembled from adrenaline, but her heart was steady. Later that afternoon, the rankings were posted. 16 names made the next round. Maya scanned the list, her eyes locked on number 12. Maya Bellamy, still in the game. A breath left her lips like release. She turned to walk away. Behind her, Gregory's voice rang out like a sneer. "Well, look at that. Miracles do happen." Maya didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She'd been through too much to flinch at cheap jabs. Because she knew what no one else in that hallway did yet. This wasn't luck. This was lived experience dressed in truth. And truth had a way of staying in the room long after the applause faded. Accused of affirmative action, but she fought with fire. The second round brought a chill far colder than the autumn wind curling through Yale's courtyards. The debate topic hit like a challenge straight to Maya's identity. Resolved. Affirmative action policies do more harm than good. The room buzzed with quiet tension as students read the assignment. Maya sat still, eyes locked on the words on her screen. Her breath caught for a moment. She knew what they'd say. That she was only there because of policies like this one. That her presence was a checkbox, a statistic, a mercy. Even before the round began, she could feel it in the hallway, in the glances that lingered too long. In the comments whispered just out of reach. "I mean, it's not like she got in on merit. Come on. No one wants to say it, but it's obvious. She stood at the edge of the dining hall, alone with her tray, watching clusters of competitors huddled over open laptops, debating points, practicing openings, laughing between sips of lattes someone else probably paid for. That night back in her dorm room, Maya stared at her blank Word document. The cursor blinked like a dare. For the first time, doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if her name wasn't on that first list because she earned it, but because someone decided they needed one more brown girl on stage? She opened her texts and scrolled through old messages. One caught her eye. "Remember, baby, you never needed anyone's permission to be great." Her mother's words, simple, unshaken. Maya straightened her shoulders and opened a dozen browser tabs. She read legal opinions, dissenting and concurring. She pulled testimony from students like her who'd thrived with access they never had before. And then, she did something most students wouldn't. She studied the arguments against her position, too, memorized their best points, anticipated every trap. She knew if she didn't understand both sides, she'd be the first to bleed on that floor. By 3 a.m., her wall was covered in notes, color-coded points, and post-its with reminders like, "Tell the truth. Don't defend yourself. Defend the idea." The next morning, Maya walked into the debate hall with her chin lifted. She didn't wear new clothes, she wore resolve. Gregory stood near the judge's table, chatting confidently with his circle. When he saw Maya enter, he smiled like he knew something she didn't. "Hope you're ready," he said. "This topic's a killer." She didn't respond. She just nodded and sat down, placing her notebook carefully on the table. Her opponent spoke first, a polished speaker from a private academy in Connecticut. She opened with data delivered with icy precision. "Affirmative action undermines meritocracy," she said. "It sends the message that students of color need help to succeed, and that's not equality, that's pity." The audience nodded. The judges scribbled. Then it was Maya's turn. She stood slowly and walked to the podium. Her hands rested on the wood for a moment before she spoke. "This conversation," she began, "isn't about lowering standards. It's about recognizing that some people have been playing on uneven ground their whole lives." She paused. "If your house catches fire and the fire truck stops at every house equally, even the ones that are fine, is that fair? Or is that just a prettier form of injustice?" She built her case not on excuses, but on exposure. She broke down legacy admissions, pointing out that nearly half of the student body came from families in the top 1%. She described the invisible ladder others were born with: private tutors, alumni recommendations, paid SAT coaches, advantages her community had never even heard of. She didn't ask for sympathy. She demanded perspective. "If we only judge potential by test scores and polished essays," she said, locking eyes with the front row, "we'll keep overlooking brilliance that blooms in hard soil." Gregory shifted in his seat. "And if you believe affirmative action is a handout," she continued, "ask yourself why no one ever calls legacy admissions a handout, because both adjust the scale. Only one makes the scale more fair." Then came the line that quieted even the most skeptical judge. "We are not lowering the bar, we are lifting the context." Silence followed. It wasn't empty, it was heavy. This time applause broke out before she even stepped away. After the round, Maya sat alone beneath the red maple tree outside the hall. Her fingers brushed fallen leaves beside her as she exhaled slowly. A student walked past and paused. One of Gregory's friends. He stared at her for a moment, then muttered, "Not bad for someone who wasn't supposed to be here." Maya looked up, her voice calm. "Then imagine what I'll do now that I am here." He blinked, then walked away. An hour later, the updated rankings were pinned to the corkboard. She scanned down the list. Number 9, quarterfinals. She exhaled again, not just from relief, but from something stronger, from knowledge. Because this round hadn't just tested her mind. It had tested her worth, and she'd answered it with every word. Sabotaged before the stage, but she rose without a script. The email came at 9:47 p.m. the night before the quarterfinal round. Subject line, urgent topic revision for tomorrow's debate. It was stamped with what looked like an official Yale address and signed by the tournament committee. Maya stared at the screen in disbelief. The original topic, one she'd spent days preparing for, had suddenly been replaced. Resolved. The American education system rewards conformity over creativity. Confused but trusting the authority of the email, Maya sat frozen for a beat. Then she pushed back her chair, grabbed her notebook, and began the race against time. There were no outlines, no saved citations, no direction. Just 10 hours and the pressure of performing in front of the same judges who would be expecting polished brilliance at sunrise. The dorm lights flickered in the late night. Everyone else had long gone to sleep or was calmly reviewing material already memorized. Maya's desk, in contrast, was chaos. Pages of half-scribbled quotes, coffee rings, highlighted news stories about underfunded arts programs and standardized testing. Her eyes were bloodshot by 2 a.m., her voice hoarse from whispering practice lines to herself. But she kept going. She had no time to think about how strange it was that no one else had mentioned a topic change. No time to wonder if something darker was at play. By morning, she walked into the debate hall with her notes still warm from her palm. Her blazer was wrinkled. Her ponytail hung loose. But her eyes were focused, even if her breath was shaky. At check-in, Professor Grant narrowed her eyes when Maya approached. "Miss Bellamy," she said, "where have you been?" Maya blinked. "I've been preparing for the revised topic." The email said. Grant interrupted. "What email?" Maya pulled out her phone, screen already open to the message. Grant studied the sender's address. "This isn't us," she said flatly. "This is fake." Maya's pulse slammed in her throat. Someone had set her up. I thought," she started, but Grant's tone was clipped cold. "Your round begins in 5 minutes, topic as scheduled." Resolved. Technology has eroded authentic human connection. Behind her, laughter drifted from the corner. Gregory stood leaning casually against the wall, hands in his pockets, smirking. He didn't have to say anything. He just mouthed the words across the room. "Oops." Maya clenched her jaw. Her hands trembled as she turned away, headed for an empty desk at the back of the hall. No outline, no citations, just her heartbeat and a blank notepad. She scribbled furiously. Her mind raced to find anchor points. Social media. Screen addiction, loss of real dialogue. She jotted bullet points like lifelines. When her name was called, her legs felt like lead. The room didn't know what had happened, but she did. She walked to the podium, holding nothing but 3 scribbled pages and everything she had left inside. Her voice shook on the first line, then steadied. "I didn't come here today to talk about numbers or theory. I came here to talk about something you already feel, but don't always name." She looked around the room. "We live behind screens now. We swipe, we scroll, we double tap. But when's the last time someone looked you in the eye and really listened?" There was a pause. "Where I come from, human connection isn't optional, it's survival. When the storm hits, when power goes out, when school closes, when your cousin goes missing, you don't send a text. You knock on doors, you stand on porches, you show up." She spoke of classmates who lost themselves to online validation, of teachers who tried to keep students engaged while competing with cell phones under the desk, of moments when silence had become more common than speech, even around dinner tables. Her voice cracked only once when she said, "Sometimes I wonder if we're more afraid of being seen than we are of being alone." Then she breathed. "We didn't lose connection because of technology. We lost it because we stopped choosing each other." She looked directly at the judges. "And maybe that's not a policy issue, maybe that's a people issue." The room didn't move, not one cough, not one shuffle of paper. When she stepped away from the podium, her hands were still shaking, but not her voice. Later that afternoon, Maya stood outside near the stone steps, staring at the leaves blowing across the courtyard. The cold wind bit at her sleeves. She kept replaying the round in her head. No data, no research, just her truth. The results came out just before sunset. She walked toward the bulletin board, her breath catching in her throat. Quarterfinal results. Rank 5, advancing to the semifinals. She didn't even smile at first, just stood there, stunned. Then slowly, her lips parted and her shoulders dropped. She had survived sabotage. And more than that, she had risen without armor. Back in the hallway, Gregory stood near the staircase, his arms folded, his jaw tight, but Maya didn't look his way. She had no time for boys who played games. Because she had learned how to win without one. Real pain, real power, her truth shook the semifinals. The topic for the semifinal round was announced before sunrise. Resolved. Social movements driven by digital activism are less effective than traditional grassroots organizing. Most competitors groaned. The topic was dense, theoretical, and hard to land with emotion. But Maya? She leaned back in her chair, eyes locked on the glowing screen, lips pressed together in a quiet, knowing smile. This wasn't theory for her. This was home, this was history. She spent the entire morning surrounded by a storm of memories. Headlines from Katrina, protest signs from Ferguson, tweets that had gone viral and saved lives, online fundraisers that rebuilt homes. Hashtags that kept missing names alive in the national conversation. She remembered her uncle's funeral after the levees broke. Remembered the cracked streets of New Orleans, water lines still etched into the walls. Remembered watching her mother fight City Hall through a laptop because no one from downtown would ever drive past their zip code. That afternoon, the debate hall filled fast. This was the round that separated the polished from the powerful. Maya stood near the side, breathing slow and steady, eyes on the stage. Her opponent, Priya Shah, was ranked second overall, a polished speaker from an elite New Jersey academy. Her confidence was obvious from the moment she stepped forward. She opened strong. "True change comes from organizing door to door, not screen to screen," Priya said. "Digital activism is fleeting. Hashtags trend and disappear. Grassroots movements, by contrast, are rooted. They last." She was clear, concise, researched. She gave examples: civil rights marches, union strikes, the slow, deliberate grind of physical protest. The audience nodded. Then Maya's name was called. She walked to the podium with the weight of 1,000 stories behind her. She didn't carry note cards, just her heart, her breath, and the voice of a people rarely heard in rooms like this. She began quietly. "I don't come from a place where protest meant gathering on manicured lawns, where speeches were broadcast live on local news, where the system welcomed your petitions." She let that hang for a moment. In the 7th Ward, after Katrina hit, no one came with clipboards and bullhorns. We didn't have City Hall's attention. We had YouTube. We had MySpace. We had Facebook groups held together by prayer and poor Wi-Fi. She looked across the room. No performance, just raw memory. "My mother raised money to rebuild our neighbor's home through a PayPal link that someone in Chicago shared. We found lost family members through Twitter threads." When they ignored our calls, our hashtags forced them to listen. She paused, her eyes welled, but she didn't flinch. Digital activism isn't perfect, but for people like us, people without titles, without connections, it's the last megaphone we have. Her voice rose with steady conviction. You say it disappears, I say it multiplies, you say it's shallow, I say it breaks silence. Then came the line that stopped every hand from writing, every breath from exhaling. Social media is the last loudspeaker we have when no one opens the church, the school, or the courthouse for us. Even Priya's face shifted, her poise cracking just slightly. Maya continued, I'm not saying we don't need marches. But don't forget, Rosa sat, Martin marched, and we tweet. Different tools, same fight. Her closing words fell like bricks laid with care. It's not the method that matters, it's whether people finally listen. Silence stretched across the room again, and then slowly, like a wave building in the back of the hall, came the applause, not scattered, not hesitant, real. When the results were posted outside, Maya stood alone, hand on her chest as her name glowed from the top 5. She had done it, she had reached the final round, and she would be facing Gregory Hawthorne next, the boy who mocked her at the door, the boy who smiled when she was sabotaged. The boy who had no idea he'd be facing not the girl from the 7th Ward anymore, but the woman shaped by fire, armed with truth, and ready to burn every lie down. In the final showdown, she didn't just speak, she exposed them. The final round began under a sky so gray it looked carved from stone. Clouds hung low over Yale's sandstone buildings, as if even the heavens were holding their breath. Inside Sanders' auditorium, every seat was filled. Professors, journalists, alumni. A few cameras lined the back wall, whispers buzzed like static before a storm. The matchup was written across the screen in bold letters. Gregory Hawthorne, Roman 3, versus Maya Bellamy. 2 names that couldn't have been more different. Gregory sat in the front row, flanked by his loyal circle. Polished, poised, legs crossed like he owned the floor already. Maya stood alone by the side curtain, notebook in her hand, her mother's words echoing inside her like a quiet drumbeat. Walk in like you've already paid for your place. The moderator stepped forward. Today's resolution. Traditional institutions remain the best guardians of academic integrity. Gregory rose first. He walked to the podium with the ease of a man raised to believe in his own permanence. Institutions like Yale, he began, are built on centuries of wisdom. They've produced presidents, judges, global leaders. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens through systems, standards, integrity. He cited academic reviews, institutional trust studies, national rankings. He quoted a former secretary of education. Every word calculated, controlled, cold. He ended with a smile. In a world of chaos, tradition is our anchor. It keeps us from drifting into mediocrity. Polite applause. Maya stood and walked to the podium without looking at Gregory. She adjusted the mic with care, placed her notebook flat, and lifted her eyes to the judges. Her voice didn't tremble. I come from a place where tradition didn't protect us, it excluded us. The pause. And if academic integrity means preserving a system that only works for the few, then it's not integrity at all. It's inheritance. She looked into the audience, her eyes unwavering. You say institutions protect fairness. But fairness would have never let me fight this hard just to be heard. Fairness would have stepped in when someone tried to sabotage me with a fake email. Fairness would have stopped you from laughing when I walked through that door. Her voice dropped into something sharper. I had to earn my seat at a table that was never set for me. If that's tradition, then maybe tradition needs to be redefined. The room shifted, tension rising like a tide. Then came cross-examination. Gregory stood, lips curled in confidence. You mention sabotage, but you provide no evidence. Are we debating personal grievances or policy here? Maya met his eyes. I'm debating reality. And in reality, I had to prepare two topics while you polished your tie. A low murmur moved through the room. Gregory pressed on. So you're saying institutions should bend to emotions? Maya didn't blink. I'm saying institutions should reflect truth. And the truth is, gatekeeping doesn't protect excellence. It protects familiarity. Gasps, one judge sat back, arms crossed, nodding slightly. Gregory's rhythm faltered. Maya stepped into rebuttal with the calm of someone who had bled for her voice. Integrity isn't just preserving what works for the powerful. It's questioning whether it ever worked for the rest of us. She laid out numbers, legacy admission rates, demographics of elite academic boards, funding disparities between public and private feeder schools. Then she closed her notebook. I didn't get here because the system welcomed me. I got here because I pushed through it. And that says more about me than it does about the system. Silence fell. Then, as if pulled by invisible thread, came the applause, not polite, not measured. It roared. Gregory sat, jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. Maya didn't smile. She just stood tall, hands steady, breathing deep. She didn't need a trophy, she had just broken the ceiling, and the room finally saw it. She kept her head high, even after learning the truth. The auditorium was nearly empty now. Just a few scattered papers left behind and the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. Maya sat alone on the stone bench outside, her body still. Her notebook rested beside her, untouched for the first time in days. The sky above Yale was soft with evening light, gold melting into gray. The competition was over. The judges had spoken, her name had been called, but something in her heart hadn't settled yet. Footsteps approached. Firm, familiar. Professor Grant sat down beside her, hands clasped, eyes forward. I thought you'd want to know, she said softly. We traced the email, the one that changed your debate topic. Maya's breath caught. Who was it? Grant turned her head, meeting Maya's eyes. It was Gregory Hawthorne, his login credentials, his IP, there's no doubt. The words fell like stones. Maya sat in silence. She didn't gasp, didn't curse. Her shoulders didn't collapse. She just closed her eyes and let the truth sit with her. Will he be punished? She asked. Grant's expression was tight. He's facing a review, but Yale protects its own. You know how that works. Maya gave a small, bitter smile. Yes, she whispered, I do. Grant leaned in slightly. You didn't just win that round today, Maya. You didn't just deliver the better speech. You kept your integrity. You didn't take the bait. You didn't become him. A long silence stretched between them. Grant's voice softened. That's why you belong here. Because even when someone tried to drag you down, you chose to rise. Maya said nothing. She just nodded, the kind that carries both pain and peace. Weeks later, the sun rose over the cracked sidewalks of New Orleans. The neighborhood was loud with life again. Kids rode rusted bikes. Radios played through open windows. A breeze rustled the thin curtains of Maya's front porch. She sat on the wooden steps with a glass of sweet tea in her hand, bare feet resting on the cool wood. A large envelope lay open beside her. Inside was an official Yale letterhead, a full scholarship to their summer pre-law program, and tucked behind it a note written in firm, looping script. Can't wait to see the road you'll walk, Maya. The world's not ready. Signed, Professor Elena Grant. Maya stared out at the horizon, the pale blue sky stretching far beyond the rooftops. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't afraid. She had come from a place no one expected. Walked through rooms designed to erase her. Stood on stages not meant for her voice. And still, she spoke. because her power didn't come from permission, it came from truth. And now, sitting on that porch in the heart of the 7th Ward, Maya Bellamy lifted her eyes to the sky, not searching for answers, but finally at peace with who she had become. She didn't need their applause. She already knew who she was. Sometimes, the strongest voice in the room isn't the loudest. It's the one that refuses to be silenced. Maya's story reminds us that you don't need a perfect stage or a famous name to speak truth. You only need the courage to stand, the wisdom to know your worth, and the grace to rise without stepping on anyone else. She didn't win because she shouted louder. She won because her words were rooted in pain, shaped by hope, and carried by dignity. And in a world that often overlooks people who look like her, Maya made sure she could never be unseen again. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know, what did Maya's journey mean to you? And if you think this was powerful, wait until you hear what's coming next. In our upcoming videos, we'll bring you more real, untold stories of Black resilience, stories of quiet strength, fierce battles, and victories that changed everything. Stories the world should have heard long ago. You won't want to miss what's ahead, because every voice matters and every story deserves to be heard.